The iron bars bent outward like twisted branches as the giant's massive fists struck them again and again, each blow echoing through the mountain valley like thunder rolling off granite peaks. Sarah Bennett pressed herself against the cold stone wall of the mining camp's makeshift prison, her heart hammering as she watched the enormous figure rage against his captivity. 8 feet tall and built like a living mountain himself, the wild man they'd captured 3 days ago had barely stopped his violent struggle since being dragged down from the high peaks. But what the miners and camp guards didn't know was that Sarah had been watching him through different eyes, seeing something they'd all missed in their fear and excitement. Behind the savage fury and inhuman strength, she'd glimpsed moments of profound pain, a lost soul trapped not just by iron bars, but by something far deeper and more tragic than any cage could represent. Tonight, as the camp settled into uneasy sleep around the reinforced prison they'd built to contain their prize, Sarah would make a choice that would change both their lives forever. In her trembling hands, she carried the one thing that might reach through the wall of rage and pain that surrounded the giant, like armor. Her grandmother's lullaby book. Worn soft by decades of loving use, its pages filled with melodies that had once soothed Sarah's own troubled dreams during the darkest period of her young life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ramshackle buildings of Copper Creek Mining Camp, nestled deep in the Colorado Rockies where civilization ended and legend began. Sarah Bennett stood at the window of the camp's medical station, watching the crowd of miners gather around the reinforced wooden cage that had become the center of everyone's attention since Tuesday morning. Inside that crude prison sat the most extraordinary and terrifying sight any of them had ever witnessed, a man who seemed more myth than reality, whose very existence challenged everything they thought they knew about the boundaries between human and beast. The giant measured over 8 feet in height, with shoulders broader than a doorframe and arms thick as tree trunks. His hair hung in tangled masses past his shoulders, dark brown streaked with premature silver that spoke of harsh years lived in unforgiving wilderness. His beard reached nearly to his chest, woven with small bones, stones, and what appeared to be crude totems made from mountain materials. But it was his eyes that haunted Sarah's dreams, pale blue like winter ice, filled with an intelligence that burned fierce and wild, yet somehow deeply wounded. When those eyes swept across the gathered crowd of gawking miners, grown men stepped backward involuntarily, sensing a predator whose strength could snap them like kindling. The creature they dubbed the Mountain Devil had been captured during a supply run to the upper mining claims, where a team of 12 men had encountered him ransacking their equipment storage. According to the survivors, only 8 had returned uninjured. The giant had fought like a force of nature, hurling grown men aside with casual ease, while roaring challenges that echoed off the mountain peaks like the voice of an ancient god. It had taken nets, ropes, and a carefully placed blow with a mining sledge to finally bring him down. Though even unconscious, he'd required 6 men to carry him back to the camp. The crude cage had been hastily constructed from the strongest timber available, reinforced with iron bands salvaged from mining equipment and locked with chains thick enough to anchor ships. Sarah had arrived at Copper Creek Mining Camp 6 months earlier, one of only 3 women in a settlement of nearly 200 men. Her official position was camp medic, though her duties extended far beyond treating mining injuries to include everything from letter writing for illiterate workers to mediating disputes that might otherwise escalate into violence. At 24, Sarah possessed the kind of quiet strength that came from surviving loss and finding purpose in helping others heal from their own wounds. Her auburn hair was usually pulled back in a practical bun, though loose strands often escaped to frame a face marked by compassion lines around green eyes that seemed to see straight through to people's souls. She'd come to Colorado territory After losing her family to cholera in Kansas, carrying little more than her medical training, her grandmother's belongings, and a determination to build a new life where her past couldn't follow. The mining camp offered decent wages, relative safety, and the kind of isolation that suited someone still healing from profound grief. But watching the caged giant, Sarah felt something stirring in her chest that she hadn't experienced since childhood, a deep empathy for something wild and wounded that others saw only as dangerous. The miners talked constantly about their prize, debating whether to contact traveling shows that might pay good money for such a spectacle, or territorial authorities who would surely be interested in studying such an unusual specimen. None of them seemed to consider that their captive might be suffering, that the rage and violence they witnessed daily might spring from sources more complex than simple animal fury. Sarah had spent enough time treating traumatized men to recognize the signs of deeper pain, and everything about the giant's behavior suggested wounds that went far beyond the physical. "Ain't natural, that thing," muttered Jake Harrison, the camp foreman, as he joined Sarah at the window. "Been 3 days now, and he ain't stopped trying to break out for more than an hour at a time. Most animals would have settled down by now, accepted their situation, but this one..." He shook his grizzled head. "This one's got too much human in him to give up, and too much beast to be reasoned with." Sarah had heard variations of this conversation dozens of times since the giant's capture, with miners struggling to categorize something that didn't fit their understanding of either human or animal behavior. The uncertainty made them nervous, evident in the way they gave the cage a wide berth while still clustering nearby, drawn by morbid fascination to something they couldn't explain or control. "Has anyone tried talking to him?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. Harrison snorted. "Talk to it? Miss Bennett, that thing ain't capable of human speech. Listen to the sounds it makes, pure animal noise, nothing more. Couple of the boys tried getting close enough to communicate, but it just roars and throws itself at the bars. Nearly took Thompson's arm off when he got too near yesterday." Sarah had observed those attempted interactions, noting how the miners approached the cage with obvious fear and hostility, treating their captive like a dangerous animal rather than a potentially intelligent being. Their body language communicated threat and dominance, exactly the kind of approach that would trigger defensive responses from any traumatized creature. The giant's violent reactions weren't random fury, but calculated responses to perceived threats. He was most aggressive when large groups gathered around his cage, calmer during the early morning hours when fewer people were present. He seemed particularly agitated by loud noises and sudden movements, suggesting a nervous system hyper-alert to danger. But Sarah had also noticed quieter moments when the giant sat motionless in his cage, staring up at the mountains visible through the gaps between buildings. During these periods, his expression changed from savage fury to something approaching profound sadness, as if he were remembering something lost and unreachable. Those moments convinced Sarah that whatever else he might be, the giant retained enough humanity to feel genuine emotion beyond rage and fear. The question was whether anyone could reach through the layers of pain and defensive violence to connect with that deeper part of his nature. The camp's treatment of their captive had grown increasingly elaborate as the days passed, with guards posted around the clock and additional reinforcements added to the cage whenever the giant's escape attempts damaged the original construction. The miners had begun charging admission to visitors from other camps, turning their prisoner into a source of entertainment and profit. Sarah found the spectacle deeply disturbing, watching grown men poke at the giant with sticks or throw rocks to provoke reactions that would amuse their audiences. The giant responded to these provocations with increasing fury, hurling himself against the bars with such force that the entire structure shook, roaring challenges that could be heard for miles across the mountain valleys. "He's getting worse," Sarah observed to Dr. Marcus Webb, the camp's senior physician, during one of their evening consultations. The constant stress and provocation are driving him toward complete breakdown. If this continues, he'll either die from exhaustion or find a way to break free and probably kill someone. Dr. Webb was a practical man in his 50s who'd seen enough frontier violence to understand the dangers of cornering wild things. "The men are excited about their prize," he admitted, "but you're right about the deterioration. Question is, what do we do about it? Can't just release something that dangerous back into the wild, and we certainly can't keep provoking it indefinitely." The conversation had planted the seed of an idea that Sarah couldn't shake, though she knew it would. Sound absurd if she voiced it directly. Her grandmother had been a woman of unusual wisdom, known throughout their Kansas community for her ability to gentle the most difficult horses and calm distressed children with equal skill. Eleanor Bennett had possessed an almost supernatural gift for reading the emotional states of both animals and humans, understanding that aggression usually masked deeper pain that could be addressed through patience and the right kind of attention. She'd taught Sarah that music, particularly lullabies, could reach parts of the mind that words couldn't touch, bypassing rational defenses to communicate directly with wounded souls. "Every creature responds to kindness," Eleanor had often said, while teaching Sarah the melodies that had been passed down through generations of Bennett women. But kindness has to be offered in a language they can understand, and sometimes that language isn't words. Sarah had used her grandmother's technique successfully during her medical training, finding that soft humming or gentle songs could calm patients during painful procedures or help traumatized individuals process difficult emotions. The approach had seemed almost magical to her colleagues, though Sarah understood it as simply another tool for healing that worked on levels deeper than conventional medicine could reach. Looking at the caged giant, Sarah began to wonder whether anyone had ever tried approaching him with genuine kindness rather than fear or dominance. His violent responses were clearly defensive, reactions to perceived threats rather than unprovoked aggression. What might happen if someone approached him without threat, offering comfort instead of confrontation? The idea was dangerous, possibly suicidal, but Sarah couldn't shake the conviction that the giant's apparent savagery masked something else entirely. The moments of sadness she'd observed suggested a capacity for complex emotion that went far beyond simple animal instinct. During her childhood, Sarah had witnessed her grandmother gentle a wounded wolf that had been trapped for days in a hunter's snare. The animal had been near mad with pain and fear when they'd found it, snapping at anyone who came near despite its obvious need for help. But Eleanor had approached it with patience and soft singing, gradually earning enough trust to treat its wounds and ultimately release it back to the wild. "Pain makes all creatures dangerous," Eleanor had explained afterward. "But underneath the pain, the original nature remains. Sometimes you just have to sing loud enough for them to remember who they really are." As night fell over Copper Creek mining camp, Sarah made her decision. She would wait until the guards changed shifts. At midnight, when there would be a brief window of reduced supervision around the cage. Then she would approach the giant not as his captor or audience, but as someone offering the one thing no one else had tried to give him. She gathered her grandmother's lullaby book from the small chest where she kept her most precious belongings, running her fingers over the worn leather cover that had witnessed decades of healing through music. The pages contained melodies from different traditions: Irish ballads, Scottish folk songs, Native American chants, and African spirituals that had somehow found their way into the Bennett family collection. Some of the songs were wordless, pure melody that transcended language barriers to communicate emotions that couldn't be captured in any specific tongue. Those would be her first offerings, simple human sounds that carried no threat and demanded no understanding beyond the recognition of kindness itself. Sarah understood that she might be walking toward her own death, that the giant's strength could end her life in seconds if her grandmother's Wisdom proved insufficient for reaching whatever humanity remained behind those pale blue eyes. But she also knew that watching him destroy himself through rage and despair was a form of cruelty she could no longer tolerate. The camp settled into its usual nighttime routine, with most miners retiring early to prepare for another day of backbreaking labor. Guards took their positions around the cage, though their attention focused more on preventing escape than monitoring what happened inside the prison. Sarah waited in her quarters, listening to the sounds of the giant's continuing struggle against his captivity, the rhythmic crash of his body against the reinforced bars, providing a heartbreaking percussion to the night's soundtrack. Each impact seemed to echo with the desperation of something that had lost everything and now faced the additional torment of being caged for the entertainment of others. At 11:30, she rose from her bed and dressed quietly, slipping the lullaby book into her medical bag, along with a small oil lamp that would provide just enough light to read the musical notation. Her hands trembled slightly as she prepared for what might be either the most important moment of her life or the last thing she would ever do. The time had come to test whether music could indeed reach where words had failed, to discover if gentle melodies could penetrate the walls of rage and pain that surrounded the most dangerous and mysterious captive Copper Creek mining camp had ever contained. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The midnight air cut through Sarah's wool coat like a blade as she stepped out of the medical station, her breath forming small clouds in the thin mountain atmosphere. Copper Creek mining camp lay silent except for the distant sounds of the giant's restless movements and the occasional murmur of guards sharing tobacco and whispered conversation near the main gate. Sarah had timed her approach carefully, knowing that the guard rotation occurred precisely at midnight when the day shift handed responsibilities to the skeleton night crew. During this transition, there would be exactly 7 minutes when the cage area would be monitored by only one man, old Pete Morrison, whose hearing had been damaged by years of blasting operations and whose attention typically focused on staying warm rather than watching a supposedly secure prisoner. She moved through the shadows between buildings, her medical bag clutched tightly against her chest, feeling the solid weight of her grandmother's lullaby book pressing against her ribs. Each step brought her closer to what might be either breakthrough or catastrophe, but Sarah felt a strange calm settling over her as she approached the reinforced structure that held the camp's most dangerous captive. The cage stood in the center of a cleared area, illuminated by a single oil lamp that cast dancing shadows across the iron-reinforced timber walls. From 30 feet away, Sarah could hear the giant's labored breathing, punctuated by occasional low growls that seemed to rumble up from somewhere deep in his massive chest. Pete Morrison sat on a wooden crate near the lamp, his rifle leaning against his shoulder while he dozed fitfully in the cold. Sarah had counted on his notorious tendency to sleep during night watch, a habit that would normally be reported to the foreman, but was overlooked due to Pete's advanced age and long service. To the mining operation. Sarah approached the cage slowly, her soft-soled boots making virtually no sound on the packed earth. As she drew closer, she could make out the giant's silhouette in the dim light, a massive figure sitting with his back against the far wall, his knees drawn up to his chest in a posture that seemed almost childlike despite his enormous size. For the first time since his capture, the giant appeared relatively calm, though Sarah could see his head turning constantly as he monitored every sound and movement in his vicinity. His pale eyes reflected the lamplight like those of a nocturnal predator, alert and calculating even in apparent rest. Sarah stopped 10 feet from the cage, far enough to avoid startling him, but close enough that her voice would carry clearly. She set down her medical bag and withdrew the lullaby book, opening it to a page marked with a faded ribbon that her grandmother had placed there decades ago. The melody written on that page was one of the oldest in the collection, a wordless tune that Eleanor Bennett had learned from her own grandmother, who claimed it originated with the Cherokee women who had once lived in the Tennessee mountains. The notation showed a simple flowing melody that rose and fell like wind through trees, requiring no instruments beyond the human voice. Sarah took a deep breath and began to hum softly, letting the ancient melody drift through the cold night air like an offering to whatever remained human in the enormous figure crouched beyond the bars. The response was immediate and startling. The giant's head snapped toward her with predatory alertness, his pale eyes locking onto her face as a low growl began building in his throat. Sarah's first instinct was to step backward, to retreat from the obvious threat of his focused attention, but she forced herself to remain still and continue humming the gentle tune. The growl grew louder, and the giant's massive frame began to tense as if preparing to launch himself at the bars that separated them. Sarah could see his hands curling into fists, his shoulders bunching with barely contained power that could probably tear through the cage's reinforcements if properly applied. But something in the melody seemed to give him pause. The growling continued, but he didn't move from his position against the far wall, instead tilting his head slightly as if trying to understand what he was hearing. Sarah kept humming, letting the wordless tune repeat and evolve as her grandmother had taught her, finding variations that felt natural while maintaining the core melody that seemed to be holding his attention. Minutes passed in this strange standoff, with Sarah humming softly while the giant watched her with an intensity that made her skin crawl despite her determination to show no fear. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the growling began to subside, though his eyes never left her face. Sarah transitioned smoothly from humming to singing the melody with soft vowel sounds, la 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 and oh oh oh, creating a more complex musical texture while still avoiding words that might trigger associations with human speech. The giant's breathing seemed to slow slightly, though he remained coiled with potential violence. Encouraged by this small change, Sarah began to incorporate hand movements that complemented the melody, gentle gestures that flowed with the music, rather than sharp motions that might be interpreted as threats. She'd learned these techniques while helping her grandmother calm agitated patients, understanding that music became more powerful when combined with visual rhythm. The giant's eyes followed her hands as they moved, and Sarah noticed that his own breathing had begun to match the tempo of her melody. This synchronization was a crucial sign that the music was beginning to affect him on a physiological level, bypassing his conscious defenses to influence his autonomic nervous system. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, Sarah noticed the giant's posture beginning to change. His shoulders relaxed slightly, and his hands unclenched from the tight fists they'd maintained since her arrival. His head stopped its constant turning as he focused entirely on her voice and movements. Most remarkably, the pale blue eyes that had burned with savage fury during his captivity began to show something else entirely, a kind of confused wonder, as if he were trying to remember something important that had been lost in the fog of pain and rage. Sarah gradually allowed her voice to grow slightly stronger, though still maintaining the soft, non-threatening quality that seemed to be working. She began to weave in fragments of other melodies from her grandmother's collection, creating a complex musical tapestry that told wordless stories of comfort, safety, and healing. The giant's response continued to evolve as the music progressed. His breathing deepened and slowed, and Sarah could see some of the tension leaving his massive frame. Most importantly, the wild alertness in his eyes began to soften, replaced by something approaching curiosity about the strange woman who sat outside his cage making beautiful sounds in the middle of the night. Sarah had been so focused on the giant's reactions that she'd almost forgotten about Pete Morrison until a soft snore reminded her of the sleeping guard's presence. She glanced toward the old man and saw that he remained deeply asleep, completely unaware of the extraordinary interaction taking place just yards from his position. This gave Sarah the confidence to continue her musical experiment, exploring different melodies and vocal techniques while carefully monitoring the giant's responses. She discovered that he seemed particularly responsive to lower, more resonant tones, and that sudden changes in tempo or volume would cause him to tense defensively. Most intriguingly, when Sarah hummed certain melodies that had minor keys or melancholy themes, she could see emotions flickering across the giant's face, expressions of sadness or longing that suggested a capacity for complex feelings that went far beyond animal instinct. After an hour of continuous singing, Sarah's voice began to show signs of strain, and she knew she would need to conclude this first session soon. But she had achieved something remarkable. For the first time since his capture, the giant appeared completely calm, sitting peacefully while watching her with what could almost be described as gentle attention. As Sarah began to bring her current melody to a close, the giant did something that nearly stopped her heart. He opened his mouth and produced a sound that wasn't a growl or roar, but a low, rumbling attempt at humming that roughly matched her tone. The sound was barely musical, more like a wolf trying to howl in harmony, but it represented something unprecedented, the giant's first attempt at communication that wasn't aggressive or defensive. He was trying to participate in the music, to connect with her through the only language that had managed to reach him. Sarah felt tears pricking her eyes as she realized the profound significance of this moment. Whatever else he might be, whatever had happened to transform him into the savage creature the miners had captured, some part of him remembered music and wanted to be part of it again. She carefully matched his awkward humming, creating a simple duet that bridged the space between them more effectively than any words could have done. For several minutes, they sang together in their strange harmony, the educated woman with her trained voice, and the wild giant with his rough attempt at melody. When Sarah finally brought the session to an end, allowing the music to fade into the mountain silence, the giant remained calm and still, watching her with eyes that no longer burned with fury, but seemed almost grateful for what she had given him. Sarah packed her grandmother's book carefully back into her medical bag, her hands trembling slightly from the emotional intensity of what had just occurred. She had proved that the giant could be reached, that beneath the rage and violence lay something that could respond to kindness and beauty. But she had also learned something darker and more troubling. During their musical connection, she had glimpsed depths of pain in the giant's eyes that spoke of trauma far beyond anything she had imagined. Whatever had happened to him, whatever had driven him to live wild in the mountains, had wounded him in ways that would require far more than a few lullabies to heal. As Sarah prepared to return to her quarters, the giant made one final sound, a soft rumble that might have been an attempt at saying goodbye, or perhaps a plea for her to return. She looked into his pale blue eyes one last time and whispered, "I'll come back tomorrow night. I promise." The giant tilted his head at her words, and Sarah could have sworn she saw understanding flicker across his features before he settled back against the wall of his cage, calmer than he had been since his capture began. Walking back through the sleeping camp, Sarah knew that everything had changed. She had established the first genuine communication with the giant, proved that he retained enough humanity to respond to music and kindness. But she had also committed herself to a dangerous path that could lead anywhere, including to discoveries about the giant's true nature that might be more terrible than the miners' simple assumption that he was merely a savage beast. Tomorrow night, she would return with more songs, more attempts to reach the wounded soul she had glimpsed behind the monster's facade. And perhaps, gradually, she might learn the truth about what had created the mountain devil of Copper Creek, and whether that truth could set them both free. Dawn broke gray and cold over Copper Creek mining camp, but Sarah Bennett had been awake. For hours, her mind churning with questions and possibilities sparked by the previous night's extraordinary encounter. She stood at her window, watching the miners gather for their morning shift while the giant sat motionless in his cage, staring up at the mountain peaks with an expression she now recognized as profound longing. The transformation in his behavior was immediately apparent to everyone in the camp. Where before he had raged continuously against his captivity, hurling himself at the bars and roaring challenges that echoed across the valley, now he remained still and watchful, as if waiting for something specific to happen. "Strangest thing I ever seen," Jake Harrison muttered as he joined Sarah for their morning medical consultation. "That beast was quiet as a lamb all night, according to Pete. No fighting, no roaring, just sitting there like he was thinking about something. Pete swears he heard music coming from somewhere, but you know how his hearing is." Sarah maintained a carefully neutral expression while her heart raced. "Perhaps he's finally accepting his situation," she suggested. "Wild animals often go through periods of adjustment when captured." But Harrison shook his grizzled head, his weathered face creased with confusion. "This ain't normal animal behavior, Miss Bennett. I've seen plenty of creatures give up fighting when they realize they're trapped. But they get listless, you know. Lose interest in everything. This one's different. He's calmer, but he's more alert than ever. Like he's waiting for something specific." Sarah spent the day treating routine mining injuries while her thoughts remained focused on the giant and the extraordinary connection they'd established through music. She had witnessed something unprecedented, a creature that everyone assumed was purely savage responding to beauty and kindness with an intelligence that suggested complex emotional capacity. But the brief glimpse she'd caught of the pain behind his eyes haunted her throughout the day. Whatever trauma had driven him to live wild in the mountains had wounded him so deeply that rage had become his only protection against further hurt. The fact that music could reach through that defensive wall suggested that somewhere in his past, gentleness had existed before being destroyed by circumstance. During her lunch break, Sarah made a decision that would have shocked the camp if they'd known about it. She approached the giant's cage in broad daylight, carrying her medical bag and wearing the calm, professional demeanor she used with all her patients. The giant watched her approach with alert attention, but none of the aggressive tension that had characterized his previous interactions with camp personnel. When she stopped at what she determined was his comfort distance, about 8 feet from the bars, he tilted his head slightly in what seemed almost like recognition. "Good afternoon," Sarah said softly, her voice carrying the same gentle tone she'd used during her nighttime singing. "I'm Sarah Bennett, the camp medic. I wanted to check on your condition." The giant's pale blue eyes focused intently on her face as she spoke, and Sarah could see him processing not just her words, but her tone and body language. There was an intelligence in his gaze that went far beyond animal cunning he was evaluating. Her, trying to understand her intentions and categorize her as either threat or ally. "I noticed you have some injuries that should be examined," Sarah continued, gesturing toward visible cuts and bruises on his massive arms and torso, souvenirs from his violent capture and subsequent struggles against the cage. "I'd like to help treat those wounds if you'll allow me." The giant's response surprised everyone within hearing distance. Instead of the growls or roars they expected, he made a low rumbling sound that was almost conversational, as if he were trying to respond to her offer in the only way he could manage. More remarkably, he shifted his position to display his injuries more clearly, extending one massive arm toward the bars so Sarah could examine a deep cut that had been inflicted during his capture. The gesture was unmistakably cooperative, suggesting that he understood her medical intentions and was willing to accept her help. Word of this interaction spread rapidly through the camp, drawing a crowd of curious miners who watched in amazement as Sarah conducted what appeared to be an actual medical consultation with their supposedly savage captive. She examined his visible injuries through the bars, explaining what she was doing in the same calm voice she used with human patients. "This cut on your forearm is infected," she observed, noting the red streaks radiating from a deep gash. "It needs to be cleaned and treated with antiseptic solution. I can prepare a poultice that will help with the healing, but I'll need to apply it directly to the wound." The giant's response to this proposition was even more startling. He looked directly into Sarah's eyes and made a sound that was clearly interrogative, a rising tone that seemed to be asking a question. Then he looked at the cage door, back to Sarah, and made the same questioning sound again. "He's asking if you're going to come inside," whispered Dr. Webb, who had hurried over when word reached him about the unprecedented interaction. That creature understands human speech better than most of the miners. Sarah felt her pulse quicken as she realized the implications of what the giant was requesting. He was willing to allow her into his cage for medical treatment, demonstrating a level of trust that contradicted everything the camp believed about his savage nature. But entering the cage would put her within reach of strength that could kill her in seconds if her assessment of his character proved wrong. "I would need to come inside to treat your wounds properly," Sarah confirmed, watching his reaction carefully. "But that would require you to remain calm and allow me to work without interference. Can you do that?" The giant nodded, an unmistakably human gesture that sent murmurs of amazement through the gathered crowd. Then he moved to the far corner of the cage and sat down with his back against the wall, positioning himself as far as possible from the door while keeping his injured arm extended in clear invitation for treatment. Dr. Webb pulled Sarah aside for a hurried consultation. "This is unprecedented," he said, his voice tight with excitement and concern. "That creature is demonstrating cognitive abilities that suggest near-human intelligence. But Miss Bennett, if you're wrong about his intentions, he could kill you before anyone could intervene." Sarah understood the risks, but she also recognized an opportunity that might never come again. The giant had offered her his trust in the most dramatic way possible, and refusing that offer would destroy any possibility of further progress in understanding his true nature. "I believe he means no harm," she said firmly. "His behavior patterns suggest someone who has been traumatized and abandoned, not someone who is inherently violent. I think he wants to be helped, but he's never been offered genuine kindness before." The camp foreman arrived as Sarah was preparing her medical supplies, and his reaction was predictably negative. "Absolutely not," Harrison declared. "I'm not having the only medic in camp killed by some mountain devil. That thing might seem calm now, but wild animals are unpredictable." But Sarah had made up her mind, and she possessed a stubborn streak that had served her well during her previous challenges. "Mr. Harrison, that man, and yes, I believe he is fundamentally human, has injuries that are becoming seriously infected. Without treatment, he could develop blood poisoning that might kill him. Are you prepared to explain to the territorial authorities how we allowed a valuable captive to die from medical neglect?" The argument about the giant's commercial value proved more persuasive than appeals to humanitarian concern. After 15 minutes of heated debate, Harrison reluctantly agreed to allow Sarah to enter the cage, provided that armed guards surrounded the structure and were prepared to shoot if the giant showed any sign of aggression. Sarah gathered her medical supplies while trying to calm her racing heart. She was about to test her growing theory that the giant's apparent savagery masked a wounded soul that could respond to kindness. But the stakes couldn't be higher. If she was wrong, she would pay for her compassion with her life. The cage door opened with a screech of rusty hinges that seemed to echo across the entire camp. Sarah stepped inside slowly, her medical bag in one hand and a bottle of antiseptic solution in the other. While every miner in the settlement held his breath, the giant remained perfectly still in his corner, watching her with those pale blue eyes that seemed to hold depths of intelligence and emotion that defied his savage reputation. As Sarah approached, he extended his injured arm further, clearly offering it for examination and treatment. "Thank you for trusting me," Sarah said softly as she knelt beside him and began cleaning the infected wound. "I know this is difficult, but I want to help you heal." What happened next would be talked about in Copper Creek mining camp for decades. Afterward, as Sarah worked on his injuries, the giant began to make soft sounds that weren't growls or roars, but something approaching speech garbled and rough, as if his voice hadn't been used for human communication in years, but unmistakably. Attempts at words. Ra, he rumbled, the syllables barely recognizable but clearly an attempt to repeat her name. Sa-ra, help. The crowd of watching miners fell completely silent as they witnessed something that challenged everything they believed about the nature of their captive. This wasn't a mindless beast or even a clever animal. This was someone who retained enough humanity to understand and attempt to use human language. Sarah felt tears pricking her eyes as she realized the full tragedy of what she was witnessing. This enormous man had been living wild in the mountains for so long that he'd almost forgotten how to speak, but the capacity for language remained buried beneath years of isolation and trauma. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "My name is Sarah, and I'm here to help you. What's your name? Can you remember your name?" The giant's face contorted with concentration and what appeared to be intense emotional pain as he struggled to access memories that had been buried beneath years of survival and rage. His massive hands clenched and unclenched as he fought to retrieve something essential that had been lost in the wilderness of his exile. Finally, in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, he managed to force out a single word that would change everything. Thomas Blackwood. The name Thomas Blackwood spread through Copper Creek mining camp like wildfire, transforming overnight from a collection of meaningless syllables into the most discussed topic in the territory. Within hours of Sarah's revelation, riders had been dispatched to every neighboring settlement, carrying urgent messages to territorial authorities and requests for information about any missing person matching the giant's description. Sarah spent the evening in Dr. Webb's quarters, carefully documenting every detail of her interaction with the man they now knew as Thomas Blackwood. The medical implications alone were staggering. Here was someone who had apparently lived wild in the mountains for years, yet retained enough cognitive function to remember his identity and attempt human communication. "In all my years of frontier medicine," Dr. Webb mused as he reviewed Sarah's notes, "I've never encountered anything like this. The physical transformation alone is extraordinary. His muscle development, bone density, and sensory adaptation suggests someone who has lived as a predator for an extended period. Yet underneath all that, his humanity persists." But Sarah's thoughts had moved beyond medical curiosity to deeper questions about the tragedy that had driven Thomas Blackwood into the wilderness. The pain she'd glimpsed in his eyes during their musical connection suggested trauma far beyond ordinary hardship, and his struggle to remember his own name indicated psychological wounds that had nearly destroyed his sense of self. "Dr. Webb," she said carefully, "I believe Thomas's condition might be psychological as much as physical. Something terrible happened to him, something that made living wild in the mountains seem preferable to remaining in civilized society. We need to understand what that was if we're going to help him truly recover." The doctor nodded thoughtfully, understanding the implications of her theory. "You're suggesting he chose this existence rather than having it forced upon him by accident or circumstance. That would explain why he retained enough intelligence to survive in conditions that would kill most men, while simultaneously losing the social skills necessary for human interaction." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Jake Harrison, whose expression mixed excitement with obvious apprehension. "Miss Bennett, Dr. Webb, we've got visitors coming up the valley. Territorial Marshal and a small cavalry detachment, probably responding to word about our unusual captive. They'll be here within the hour." Sarah felt her stomach clench with sudden anxiety as she realized the implications of official attention focused on Thomas Blackwood. Military intervention could destroy any chance of continued progress in helping him recover his humanity, while territorial authorities might have their own agenda for dealing with someone whose very existence challenged conventional understanding of the boundary between civilization and wildness. "We need to prepare Thomas for what's coming," Sarah said urgently. If he reverts to aggressive behavior when strangers arrive, they might decide he's too dangerous to handle with anything other than force. Dr. Webb gathered his medical equipment, while Sarah collected her grandmother's lullaby book, both understanding that the next few hours would determine whether Thomas Blackwood received the help he needed or became another casualty of frontier justice. They hurried across the camp toward his cage, where a small crowd had maintained constant vigil since the afternoon's dramatic revelations. Thomas sat in his usual position against the far wall, but Sarah immediately noticed increased tension in his massive frame. His pale blue eyes tracked constantly between the cage entrance and the mountain trails that led into the valley, and his breathing had taken on the rapid, shallow pattern that preceded his most violent episodes. "He knows something's changed," Sarah observed as she approached the cage. "His senses are probably acute enough to detect the approaching horses from miles away, and he's interpreting their arrival as a threat." Thomas's gaze locked onto Sarah's face as she moved within his comfortable communication distance, and she could see recognition and something approaching relief in his expression. He had learned to associate her presence with safety and kindness, making her arrival a source of comfort rather than additional stress. "Thomas," Sarah said softly, using his name deliberately to reinforce his human identity. "There are people coming to meet you, officials who want to understand what happened to you. I know this is frightening, but I'll stay with you. We're going to face this together." Thomas's response was immediate and heartbreaking. He reached toward the bars with one massive hand, not aggressively but in a gesture that clearly sought contact and reassurance. Sarah extended her own hand to touch his fingers through the iron reinforcements, establishing physical connection that seemed to calm his increasing agitation. "Sa-ra ... Stay?" The words were clearer than his previous attempts at speech, though still rough and halting. Thomas ... scared. The admission of fear from someone whose physical presence intimidated every man in the camp struck Sarah with profound emotion. Behind the giant's savage exterior lay someone who retained enough humanity to understand vulnerability and seek comfort from another person, despite years of isolation that had nearly destroyed his capacity for human connection. "I'll stay," Sarah promised, maintaining the gentle contact while beginning to hum one of the melodies that had proven most effective in calming his distress. "Remember the music, Thomas. Remember that you're not alone anymore." The approaching sound of multiple horses echoed off the valley walls as the territorial marshal's party drew closer to the camp. Thomas's tension increased with each hoofbeat, but Sarah's continued humming seemed to provide an anchor of familiarity that prevented him from sliding into the rage that had characterized his previous encounters with groups of strangers. Marshal Henry Caldwell arrived with 6 cavalry troopers and a man whose expensive clothing and authoritative manner marked him as someone with significant political influence. The official party dismounted near the camp's main buildings, and Sarah could hear urgent conversations as Harrison briefed them on the situation. "Miss Bennett," Dr. Webb said quietly, "that civilian with the marshal is Territorial Administrator James Whitmore from Denver. His presence suggests this situation has attracted attention at the highest levels of government. We need to be very careful about how we present Thomas's condition." Sarah understood the warning implicit in the doctor's words. Territorial authorities faced constant pressure to demonstrate control over their assigned regions, and the discovery of someone living wild in supposedly pacified territory could be interpreted as evidence of administrative failure. If Thomas was perceived as a threat to public safety or territorial stability, official response might prioritize elimination over rehabilitation. The official party approached the cage with obvious caution, their hands resting on weapon grips, as they took in the extraordinary sight of an 8-foot giant sitting calmly beside a young woman who hummed lullabies through the iron bars. Marshal Caldwell was a lean man in his 40s whose weathered face suggested extensive frontier experience. while Administrator Whitmore appeared distinctly uncomfortable with the rustic conditions of the mining camp. "Miss Bennet, I presume," Marshal Caldwell said with professional courtesy. "I'm told you've had considerable success in communicating with this individual. Can you explain the nature of his condition and the circumstances that led to his capture?" Sarah chose her words carefully, understanding that her description would influence official policy toward Thomas. "Marshal Caldwell, this is Thomas Blackwood, a man who has apparently lived in isolation for several years due to circumstances we're still trying to understand. His condition appears to be primarily psychological rather than physical. He retains human intelligence and language capacity, though both have been affected by extended trauma and isolation." Administrator Whitmore stepped forward, his expression mixing curiosity with obvious distaste for the crude conditions surrounding them. "Miss Bennet, territorial records contain no information about any missing person named Thomas Blackwood. Are you certain of his identity?" The question sparked Thomas's first direct response to the newcomers, though his reaction demonstrated how much his communication skills had already improved. Through his interactions with Sarah, instead of growling or roaring, he looked directly at Whitmore and spoke in his halting but increasingly clear voice. "Thomas Blackwood," he said firmly, each syllable carefully pronounced despite the obvious effort required. "Lost ... family. Lost everything." The officials exchanged glances that reflected their amazement at witnessing coherent speech from someone they'd expected to be a savage beast. Marshal Caldwell leaned closer to the cage, his professional instincts clearly engaged by this evidence of complex intelligence. "Mr. Blackwood," the marshal said formally, treating Thomas as a person rather than a curiosity, "can you tell us what happened to your family? Where did you live before coming to the mountains?" Thomas's face contorted with emotional pain as he struggled to access memories that had been buried beneath years of survival and rage. His massive hands clenched and unclenched as he fought to retrieve information from a past that had been too painful to remember clearly. "Fire," he finally whispered, the single word carrying devastating weight. "All ... burned. Emily. Little James ... gone." Sarah felt tears pricking her eyes as she realized the depth of tragedy that had driven Thomas Blackwood into the wilderness. The loss of a family to fire would explain both his psychological trauma and his choice to abandon civilization for a life of isolation among the mountains. "Where did this fire occur?" Marshal Caldwell pressed gently, understanding that establishing specific details would be crucial for verifying Thomas's story and potentially providing closure for his tragedy. Thomas closed his eyes as if the effort of remembering caused physical pain, but when he opened them again, his voice was stronger and clearer than anyone had heard since his capture. "Peaceful Valley," he said. "Settlement. North of Boulder. 3 years, maybe 4, Thomas built. Cabin for Emily, little James ... learning to read." Administrator Whitmore's expression changed dramatically as recognition dawned. "Peaceful Valley Settlement," he said with sudden intensity. "I remember that incident. It was one of the worst tragedies in territorial history. Lightning strike started a forest fire that consumed the entire settlement in a matter of hours. Official records listed 17 dead, with several residents unaccounted for and presumed killed." Sarah watched Thomas's face as the official confirmation of his family's death reopened wounds that had never properly healed. The giant who had seemed so powerful and dangerous revealed himself as a broken man whose apparent savagery had been armor protecting the grief too deep for human bearing. "Thomas Blackwood was listed among the missing," Whitmore continued, consulting notes from a leather portfolio. "Homesteader, former lumber mill operator from Pennsylvania. Wife Emily, son James, age 6. The family had been in the territory for less than 2 years when the fire occurred." The revelation transformed the entire situation, replacing speculation with documented tragedy that explained every aspect of Thomas's condition. He hadn't chosen wildness from preference, but had fled into the mountains to escape a civilized world that no longer contained anything worth preserving. Marshall Caldwell studied Thomas with new understanding, recognizing a fellow human being whose response to overwhelming loss had taken an extreme but comprehensible form. "Mr. Blackwood," he said respectfully, "I'm sorry for your loss. What the territorial government needs to understand now is whether you're prepared to return to civilized society, or if you prefer to remain in the wilderness." Thomas looked at Sarah before answering, and she could see him weighing options that would determine the rest of his life. The mountains had been his refuge from unbearable pain, but his interactions with her had reminded him that human connection could offer comfort rather than additional suffering. "Sarah ... helps," he said finally. "Thomas ... wants to remember how to be human again." The decision to transfer Thomas Blackwood from the crude mining camp cage to a proper facility sparked the most heated debate in Copper Creek's history. Administrator Whitmore advocated for immediate relocation to the Territorial Asylum in Denver, arguing that someone in Thomas's condition required specialized medical attention that couldn't be provided in a frontier mining operation. Marshall Caldwell disagreed, believing that Thomas's remarkable progress under Sarah's care demonstrated the value of maintaining familiar surroundings and relationships during his rehabilitation. Moving him to an institutional environment might undo the fragile trust and communication breakthrough that had been achieved through her musical therapy, but it was Sarah herself who proposed the solution that would shape the next crucial phase of Thomas's recovery. Standing in the camp's meeting hall while officials debated his fate, she presented an alternative that nobody had considered. "Gentlemen," she said with quiet conviction, "Thomas Blackwood doesn't need an asylum. He needs a home. What I'm proposing is that we establish a proper rehabilitation facility right here in the valley, where he can continue making progress while gradually readjusting to civilized society." Dr. Webb immediately endorsed the proposal, understanding that Sarah's unique connection with Thomas represented their best hope for achieving genuine healing rather than mere institutional management. "Miss Bennett is correct," he said firmly. "Moving Thomas to Denver would separate him from the only person who has successfully reached through his trauma. That could trigger a complete regression to his previous savage state." The debate continued for hours, with territorial officials weighing the political implications of establishing an unofficial rehabilitation center in the remote mountains versus the potential embarrassment of institutional failure if Thomas proved impossible to treat through conventional methods. Finally, Administrator Whitmore reached a pragmatic compromise that satisfied everyone's concerns while providing Thomas with the specialized attention his condition required. The territorial government would fund construction of a proper treatment facility adjacent to the mining camp, staffed by qualified medical personnel, but maintaining Sarah Bennett as the primary therapeutic coordinator. "Miss Bennett," Whitmore said formally, "the Territory of Colorado hereby appoints you as special medical advisor for the Blackwood case, with full authority to design and implement whatever treatment protocols you deem appropriate. You'll have access to any resources necessary for his rehabilitation, including additional medical staff, specialized equipment, and educational materials." Sarah felt the weight of enormous responsibility settling on her shoulders as she realized that Thomas's future now depended entirely on her ability to guide him through the complex process of recovering his humanity. She had proven that music could reach him, but transforming those initial breakthrough moments into sustained progress would require skills and knowledge she was still developing. Construction of the rehabilitation facility began immediately, with skilled carpenters and masons working alongside mining camp personnel to create something unprecedented in territorial history, a treatment center specifically designed for helping someone recover from extreme psychological trauma and social isolation. The main building featured large windows that provided natural light and mountain views, understanding that Thomas's connection to the wilderness had been his primary source of comfort during his years of exile. Living quarters were designed with reinforced construction for safety, but emphasized comfort and humanity rather than the prison-like atmosphere of his original cage. Most importantly, the facility included a specially designed music room where Sarah could conduct her therapeutic sessions without interruption or distraction. The space featured excellent acoustics, comfortable seating, and a collection of musical instruments that might eventually help Thomas rediscover creative expression as part of his healing process. While construction proceeded, Sarah worked with Thomas daily to maintain and expand the progress they'd achieved through their initial musical connections. His language skills improved rapidly with consistent practice, though his voice retained the deep, rough quality that years of disuse had created. Sarah teaches Thomas words, he said during one of their morning sessions, his speech becoming more fluid with each conversation. Thomas remembers reading stories to little James. These glimpses into his previous life as a father and husband provided crucial insights into the man he had been before tragedy transformed him into the mountain devil of local legend. Sarah began incorporating memory recovery techniques into their sessions, using music to help Thomas access buried recollections that might aid his psychological healing. "Tell me about the stories you read to James," Sarah encouraged. Her grandmother's lullaby book opened to a page featuring a gentle melody that seemed to calm Thomas's distress when discussing his lost family. What were his favorite tales? Thomas's massive face softened with remembered love as he struggled to retrieve precious memories from the wreckage of his former life. Little boy loved animal stories. Thomas would make voices for bear and rabbit and fox. Sarah began humming softly as Thomas spoke, creating a musical backdrop that seemed to help him access increasingly detailed memories. She had discovered that certain melodies appeared to unlock specific emotional states, allowing him to discuss painful topics without becoming overwhelmed by grief or rage. James wanted to be mountain man, Thomas continued, his voice growing stronger as the memories became clearer. Thomas promised teach him tracking and camping when boy got bigger. The irony of those childhood dreams wasn't lost on Sarah, understanding that Thomas had ultimately become the mountain man his son had admired, though in ways that would have horrified the loving father who had made those innocent promises. The wilderness skills that had kept Thomas alive during his exile had been learned for the purpose of sharing adventures with a child who would never grow old enough to experience them. Webb documented Thomas's progress meticulously, creating detailed records that would guide future treatment while providing evidence of recovery that territorial authorities required for continued funding. The medical implications of Thomas's condition fascinated the scientific community, with requests for information arriving from physicians and researchers throughout the American West. His physical transformation is remarkable, Dr. Webb noted. During one of his weekly reports to Denver, muscle density, sensory acuity, and reflexes all demonstrate adaptation to predatory lifestyle. Yet these changes don't appear to be permanent. As his psychological state improves, his physical characteristics are gradually returning to more normal human parameters. But the most significant breakthrough came during Thomas's third week of intensive rehabilitation, when Sarah introduced him to children's songs from her grandmother's collection. These simple melodies, designed for young voices and innocent hearts, seemed to unlock something profound in Thomas's damaged psyche. "Twinkle, twinkle, little star," Sarah sang softly, watching Thomas's reaction to the familiar childhood tune. "How I wonder what you are." Thomas's response was immediate and overwhelming. Tears began streaming down his bearded face as he joined his deep voice to hers, remembering words he had sung to his own child during bedtime routines that had ended. "In flame and death, up above the world so high," they sang together, their voices creating an unlikely harmony that bridged the gap between Sarah's trained soprano and Thomas's rough bass. Like a diamond in the sky. For the first time since his capture, Thomas wept openly, releasing grief that had been locked away beneath layers of rage and survival instinct. Sarah continued singing while he sobbed, understanding that this emotional release was a crucial step in his healing process. James loved the song, Thomas managed between tears. Thomas sang it every night before sleep. The breakthrough opened new possibilities for therapeutic intervention, with Sarah developing a systematic approach that used childhood songs to help Thomas reconnect with positive memories from his life as a father and husband. Each recovered memory seemed to strengthen his grip on his human identity, while weakening the savage persona that had dominated his mountain exile. Word of Thomas's remarkable progress attracted attention from unexpected sources, including representatives of Eastern medical schools who wanted to study his case and document the therapeutic techniques that were proving so effective. Sarah found herself corresponding with leading psychiatrists and neurologists who saw Thomas's recovery as potentially revolutionary for understanding trauma treatment. But the most meaningful validation came from Thomas himself, as he gradually reclaimed aspects of his personality that had been buried beneath years of pain and isolation. His sense of humor began to emerge during their sessions, with gentle jokes and observations that revealed the intelligent, caring man he had been before tragedy changed everything. Sarah patience with slow student, he said one afternoon, struggling to read from a children's book she had introduced as part of his cognitive rehabilitation. Thomas feels like little boy learning letters. Sarah smiled at his self-deprecating comment, recognizing the profound courage it took for someone of his size and strength to admit vulnerability and accept help with basic skills. Learning is never shameful, Thomas. You're not a slow student, you're someone recovering from terrible loss, and that takes a different kind of strength than most people ever need. As autumn approached the Colorado mountains, the rehabilitation facility neared completion while Thomas's progress continued to exceed everyone's expectations. His speech had become fluent enough for complex conversations. His reading skills were rapidly returning, and most importantly, his capacity for human connection was being restored through their daily musical therapy sessions. The man who had been captured as a savage beast was clearly becoming someone who might eventually return to civilized society, though Sarah understood that his healing journey was far from complete. The facility's formal opening would mark the beginning of a new phase in his recovery, one that would test whether the progress they'd achieved in isolation could survive exposure to a broader community. Standing in the completed music room as workers put finishing touches on the rehabilitation center, Sarah felt a mixture of pride and apprehension about what lay ahead. She had proven that music could indeed reach through walls of trauma and pain to touch the human soul. But transforming those initial breakthrough moments into lasting recovery would require sustained effort and unwavering faith in Thomas's capacity for healing. The giant who had once been caged like a beast was learning to be gentle as a lamb. But the most challenging part of his journey was just beginning. Soon, Thomas Blackwood would need to discover whether the humanity he was recovering could survive contact with a world that had given him nothing but loss and pain. The first snowfall of winter arrived early that year, dusting the Colorado peaks with pristine white that transformed the rehabilitation facility into something resembling a picture from a fairy tale. Sarah Bennett stood at the large windows of the music therapy room, watching Thomas Blackwood tend to a small garden he had planted behind the main building, his first voluntary engagement with creative, nurturing activity since beginning his recovery. 6 weeks had passed since the facility's official opening, and Thomas's progress had become the subject of medical journals and newspaper articles throughout the territory. His transformation from savage mountain man to articulate, Gentle Giant represented a triumph of innovative treatment that challenged conventional understanding of trauma recovery, but success had brought unexpected complications that threatened everything Sarah had worked to achieve. The territorial government, initially supportive of her experimental approach, was now facing political pressure to demonstrate that Thomas posed no danger to public safety. Recent incidents involving escaped criminals and territorial border disputes had created a climate where any perceived security risk became magnified into a political crisis. Miss Bennett, Administrator Whitmore had written in his latest correspondence, "While we commend the remarkable progress achieved with Mr. Blackwood, territorial authorities require concrete demonstration that he can interact safely with the general public before approving his full rehabilitation. We are therefore implementing a formal evaluation process that will test his readiness for eventual reintegration into civilized society." The evaluation process involved bringing strangers to the facility, territorial officials, medical professionals, and selected community representative who would observe and interact with Thomas to assess his stability and social competence. Sarah understood the necessity of such testing, but she also recognized the enormous risk it posed to Thomas's still fragile psychological equilibrium. Thomas had made extraordinary progress in recovering his humanity through their controlled, supportive interactions, but his trust in other people remained limited and conditional. Exposing him to potential rejection, fear, or hostility from strangers could trigger regression to the defensive behaviors that had characterized his mountain exile. Sarah worried. Thomas observed with his characteristic directness as they worked together in the garden, his speech now fluent, though still marked by the careful precision of someone relearning language skills. Thomas sees fear in Sarah's eyes when she thinks about visitors coming. Sarah couldn't hide her concern from someone who had developed supernatural ability to read human emotions during his years of survival. Thomas's empathetic sensitivity had become one of his most remarkable characteristics. He could detect subtle changes in mood or intention that escaped normal observation, a skill that had probably kept him alive during his wilderness exile. "I am worried," Sarah admitted. Pulling weeds from around the winter vegetables Thomas had insisted on planting despite the approaching cold season. "You've made incredible progress, but I know how difficult it will be for you to trust strangers. Some of the people coming to evaluate you might not understand how much courage it takes for you to interact with them." Thomas nodded thoughtfully, his pale blue eyes reflecting understanding that went beyond mere intellectual comprehension. Thomas was afraid of Sarah too, first time. Sarah sang songs. Thomas remembered being human, maybe. Thomas can help visitors remember being human too. His insight into the reciprocal nature of their therapeutic relationship surprised Sarah with its sophistication. Thomas had recognized that healing required active participation from both parties, that just as Sarah's music had helped him recover his humanity, his own gentle responses could help fearful visitors overcome their preconceptions about his nature. The first evaluation session was scheduled for the following Monday, with a carefully selected group that included Dr. Margaret Phillips from the Denver Medical College, Reverend Jonathan Hayes from the Territorial Chaplain Service, and Mrs. Elizabeth Crawford, President of the Colorado Women's Charitable Society. Each represented different aspects of community leadership whose endorsement would be crucial for Thomas's eventual acceptance in civilized society. Sarah spent the weekend preparing both Thomas and herself for what would essentially be a performance designed to demonstrate his fitness for freedom. They practiced conversation skills, reviewed appropriate social behaviors, and rehearsed responses to potentially challenging questions about his mountain experience and future intentions. But the most important preparation involved music, with Sarah teaching Thomas simple songs that he could perform for the visitors to demonstrate his artistic sensitivity and emotional sophistication. His deep bass voice had developed remarkable control through months of practice, and his ability to harmonize with Sarah's soprano created musical moments of profound beauty. Remember, Sarah coached him during their final practice session. These people want to believe that you've recovered your humanity. They're not your enemies. They're just afraid because they don't understand what you've been through. Your job is to help them see the gentle, intelligent man you've become. Monday morning arrived gray and cold with the evaluation committee, traveling up from Denver in a convoy of carriages that announced their importance to everyone in the valley. Sarah watched from the facility's main entrance as the officials dismounted, noting the mixture of curiosity and apprehension in their faces as they approached the building, where the famous mountain devil was supposedly being transformed into a civilized human being. Dr. Margaret Phillips was a stern woman in her 50s whose reputation for scientific rigor was matched by her known skepticism about unconventional medical approaches. She had publicly questioned whether psychological trauma could produce the kind of extreme behavioral changes attributed to Thomas, suggesting that his apparent savagery might be evidence of underlying mental defect rather than recoverable condition. Reverend Hayes represented the territorial government's desire to address moral and spiritual dimensions of Thomas's rehabilitation, based on the theory that genuine reformation required religious conversion in addition to medical treatment. His presence indicated official concern about whether someone who had lived as a beast could truly reclaim the moral sensibilities necessary for civilized behavior. Mrs. Crawford's inclusion reflected political awareness that women's organizations wielded significant influence over territorial social policies. Her endorsement would be particularly valuable for demonstrating that Thomas posed no threat to vulnerable community members, especially children and families. Sarah met the evaluation committee in the facility's reception area, briefing them on Thomas's progress while attempting to prepare them for their first encounter with someone whose physical presence remained genuinely intimidating despite his gentle temperament. Mr. Blackwood stands over 8 feet tall and weighs approximately 350 pounds, she explained, noting the visitor's expressions of surprise at these statistics. His voice is very deep and his movements are naturally powerful, due to years of wilderness adaptation. However, I want to emphasize that he is extraordinarily gentle and has never shown the slightest tendency toward violence since beginning his recovery. Dr. Phillips interrupted with professional skepticism. Miss Bennett, while we appreciate your therapeutic success, our evaluation must consider Mr. Blackwood's potential for behavioral regression under stress. Someone with his physical capabilities could cause enormous damage if he experienced psychological crisis in a populated area. Sarah understood the legitimacy of such concerns, but she also recognized the unfairness of holding Thomas accountable for hypothetical future behavior rather than his demonstrated current character. Dr. Phillips, I believe you'll find that Mr. Blackwood's psychological stability has improved dramatically through treatment. He's developed excellent self-awareness and emotional regulation skills that make regression extremely unlikely. The committee followed Sarah through the facility's corridors toward the music therapy room, where Thomas waited with obvious nervousness despite weeks of preparation. Sarah had positioned him near the piano, where his association with music would immediately signal his artistic sensitivity to visitors who might otherwise focus only on his imposing physical presence. Thomas rose when they entered, his massive frame unfolding with fluid grace that demonstrated remarkable self-control. He was dressed in specially tailored clothing that accommodated his extraordinary size while maintaining dignity and respectability. Dark wool trousers, white cotton shirt, and a vest that emphasized his status as a gentleman rather than a wild man. "Good morning," Thomas said with careful formality, his deep voice controlled and respectful. "Thomas Blackwood is honored to meet distinguished visitors. Sarah tells Thomas that you have traveled far to assess Thomas's progress in recovering human behavior." The committee member's surprise at his articulate speech was immediately apparent, though Dr. Phillips maintained professional composure while studying Thomas with clinical attention. Reverend Hayes appeared genuinely amazed by the transformation. From savage legend to polite gentleman, while Mrs. Crawford seemed torn between fascination and residual fear of his imposing presence. "Mr. Blackwood," Dr. Phillips said formally, "we're here to evaluate your readiness for potential reintegration into territorial society. Can you tell us about your current understanding of civilized behavior and social responsibility?" Thomas considered the question carefully before responding, demonstrating the thoughtful approach to communication that Sarah had helped him develop. Thomas understands that living among people requires consideration for others' comfort and safety. Thomas was husband and father before tragedy, so Thomas remembers responsibilities of community membership. Thomas wants to contribute positively to society, perhaps through work that uses Thomas's knowledge of wilderness survival. His answer impressed the committee with its sophistication and self-awareness, but Dr. Phillips pressed further with questions designed to test his emotional stability. "Mr. Blackwood, what would you do if you encountered situations that reminded you of the traumatic events that led to your mountain exile?" The question touched on Sarah's deepest concerns about Thomas's readiness for public exposure, but his response demonstrated remarkable psychological insight. "Thomas still feels great sadness about losing Emily and little James," he said quietly. "But Thomas has learned from Sarah that grief becomes manageable when shared with caring people." Thomas would seek help from friends rather than retreating to wilderness if reminded of painful memories. Mrs. Crawford leaned forward with obvious interest in his reference to family loss. "Mr. Blackwood, do you believe you could safely interact with children, given your tragic experience with your own son?" Thomas's face softened with gentle emotion as he considered her question. Thomas misses little James every day, but that makes Thomas want to protect all children, not harm them. Thomas remembers joy of teaching child about nature and stories. Perhaps someday Thomas could help other children learn about mountains and wilderness, but only if their parents feel safe with Thomas's presence. The sincerity and wisdom of his response clearly moved Mrs. Crawford, though she maintained professional objectivity while making notes about his emotional responses. Reverend Hayes stepped forward with questions about Thomas's spiritual condition and moral development. "Mr. Blackwood, during your years in the wilderness, did you maintain any connection to religious faith or moral principles?" Thomas's answer revealed depths of philosophical thought that surprised everyone present. Thomas talked to God among the mountains, but mostly Thomas was angry about losing family. Sarah's music helped Thomas remember that love is stronger than anger, and that Emily and James would want Thomas to find peace rather than live in rage. Thomas thinks God speaks through people who offer kindness to those who are lost. His theological sophistication impressed Reverend Hayes, who had expected to encounter someone requiring basic religious instruction rather than complex spiritual insight. The committee continued their questioning for nearly 2 hours, covering topics from practical life skills to psychological stability to social integration challenges. Throughout the evaluation, Thomas maintained the patient dignity that had become characteristic of his recovered personality, answering difficult questions with honesty while demonstrating the emotional regulation skills that Sarah's therapy had helped him develop. The session concluded with a musical performance that Sarah had specifically designed to showcase Thomas's artistic sensitivity and emotional depth. They performed a duet arrangement of Amazing Grace that allowed Thomas's powerful bass voice to support Sarah's soprano and harmonies that filled the room with transcendent beauty. As the final notes faded, Sarah could see tears in Mrs. Crawford's eyes and genuine amazement in Dr. Phillips's professional expression. Even Reverend Hayes appeared moved by the spiritual power of their musical collaboration. "Mr. Blackwood," Dr. Phillips said formally, "your progress is remarkable, and your current presentation suggests successful psychological rehabilitation. However, our final recommendation will depend on additional evaluation sessions that test your responses to various social situations and potential stressors. Sarah felt both relief and continued concern as the committee prepared to depart. Thomas had passed his first major test, demonstrating that his recovery was genuine and profound. But she knew that future evaluations would become more challenging as officials tested the limits of his psychological stability and social readiness. That evening, as Sarah and Thomas sat together in the music room reviewing the day's events, she felt profound pride in how far he had traveled from the caged savage, who had first heard her lullabies echoing through the mountain darkness. "Thomas did well today," she said, offering the praise he had earned through months of difficult therapeutic work. "Sarah taught Thomas how to be human again," he replied with characteristic directness. "Thomas hopes to make Sarah proud when next visitors come." Looking at the gentle giant who had once been feared as the mountain devil, Sarah knew that the most difficult tests still lay ahead. But she also understood that they had created something unprecedented, proof that even the most profound trauma could be healed through patience, music, and the transformative power of human compassion. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late November, delivered by a territorial courier whose grim expression suggested he carried more than routine correspondence. Sarah Bennett recognized the official seal of the Denver Territorial Court as she accepted the document, but nothing could have prepared her for the devastating contents that would threaten to destroy everything she and Thomas had accomplished. "Miss Bennett," the legal notice began in formal bureaucratic language, "this court has received a petition from Mrs. Victoria Blackwood of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, claiming to be the lawful sister-in-law of one Thomas Blackwood currently under your medical supervision. Mrs. Blackwood alleges that the individual in question abandoned his legal and financial responsibilities following a family tragedy, leaving significant debts and obligations that remain unresolved." Sarah's hands trembled as she continued reading the document that transformed Thomas from a recovering trauma victim into a potential fugitive from financial responsibility. According to the petition, Emily Blackwood's sister Victoria claimed that Thomas had borrowed substantial sums against his lumber mill operation in Pennsylvania before moving west, and that his disappearance following the Peaceful Valley fire had left creditors unable to collect on legitimate debts. Furthermore, the letter continued, Mrs. Blackwood asserts that her brother-in-law's current condition may be the result of deliberate deception rather than genuine psychological trauma, suggesting that he has assumed the identity of the mountain devil to avoid accountability for his financial obligations. The court hereby orders a formal investigation into these allegations, with proceedings to commence within 30 days of this notice. Dr. Webb found Sarah in the facility's office. An hour later, staring at the legal documents with an expression of stunned disbelief. "What's happened?" he asked, immediately recognizing the signs of a crisis that could undermine everything they'd worked to achieve. Sarah handed him the court order without speaking, watching his face darken as he absorbed the implications of the accusations against Thomas, the suggestion that his mountain exile might have been calculated deception rather than trauma response struck at the very foundation of their therapeutic work together. "This is preposterous," Dr. Webb said after finishing the document. "I've spent months documenting Thomas's psychological condition and recovery process. There's absolutely no evidence that his behavior has been anything other than genuine response to overwhelming grief and loss." But Sarah understood that medical opinion would carry little weight against legal proceedings that questioned Thomas's fundamental honesty about his identity and motivations. If Victoria Blackwood could convince a court that Thomas had deliberately abandoned his responsibilities, his current recovery might be interpreted as elaborate performance rather than authentic healing. "We need to tell Thomas immediately," Sarah said, dreading the conversation that would force them to discuss the very financial obligations he had fled into the wilderness to escape. "He has a right to know what accusations are being made against him, and we need to understand his perspective on these alleged debts." They found Thomas in the workshop he had established behind the main building, where he spent hours crafting wooden toys and simple furniture with tools adapted for his enormous hands. The creative work had become an important part of his therapeutic routine, providing tangible evidence of his capacity for patient, detailed labor that contradicted assumptions about his savage nature. "Thomas," Sarah said gently, settling onto a bench beside his workstation, "we've received some disturbing news from the territorial court. There are questions being raised about your life before the Peaceful Valley fire, particularly regarding financial obligations you may have left unresolved." Thomas's hands stilled on the wooden horse he was carving for a child in the nearby mining camp, and Sarah could see tension building in his massive shoulders as he processed her words. His pale blue eyes took on the distant quality that appeared when he was accessing painful memories from his previous life. "Victoria," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight of complicated emotion. "Emily's sister. Thomas remembers Victoria. Disapproved of Emily marrying lumber mill worker instead of gentleman from Philadelphia society. Victoria always believed Thomas was beneath Emily's station." The personal history behind the legal accusations began to clarify as Thomas shared details about his relationship with his deceased wife's family. Victoria Blackwood had opposed Emily's marriage from the beginning, viewing Thomas as an unsuitable match for a woman of her sister's education and social background. "Thomas did borrow money for mill expansion," he admitted, his voice heavy with shame at having to acknowledge financial failures alongside his personal tragedy. Business was struggling because railroad companies brought cheaper lumber from northern forests. Thomas thought new equipment would allow mill to compete, but fire destroyed everything before loans could be repaid. Sarah felt her heart sink as she realized that Victoria's accusations contained enough truth to create serious legal complications, even if her interpretation of Thomas's motivations was completely wrong. He had indeed left unresolved debts when he fled to Colorado Territory, though his reasons had been psychological breakdown rather than deliberate deception. "Thomas never intended to abandon responsibilities," he continued, his massive hands clenching as he struggled with guilt that had been buried beneath years of survival focus. When Emily and James died, Thomas could think only of escaping reminders of everything lost. Thomas ran to mountains to escape pain, not to escape creditors. Dr. Webb documented every detail of Thomas's account, understanding that his medical testimony about trauma responses would be crucial for defending against allegations of deliberate fraud. The distinction between psychological flight and calculated deception would determine whether Thomas faced criminal prosecution or continued medical treatment, but the legal challenge represented more than administrative complications. It threatened to undermine Thomas's psychological recovery by forcing him to confront guilt and shame that had driven him into the wilderness originally. Sarah could see the familiar signs of emotional distress beginning to manifest as Thomas struggled with conflicting obligations to his dead wife's family and his own survival. "Thomas must face consequences of failures," he said with the rigid self-judgment that had characterized his early recovery phases. "Victoria is correct that Thomas abandoned responsibilities. Perhaps Thomas deserves punishment rather than kindness." Sarah recognized the dangerous psychological territory they were entering as Thomas began questioning his worthiness for the compassion that had enabled his healing. Self-blame and guilt had been the emotional forces that originally drove him to mountain exile, and Victoria's accusations threatened to trigger the same destructive patterns. "Thomas," Sarah said firmly, using the authoritative tone she had developed for interrupting his negative thought spirals, "surviving trauma doesn't make you responsible for every consequence of that survival. You lost your family in a horrible tragedy, and your response was human and understandable, even if it created complications for other people." But Thomas's newly recovered capacity for moral reasoning made him acutely aware of the harm his disappearance might have caused to innocent creditors who had trusted him with their money. The ethical sophistication that marked his psychological recovery now became a source of additional guilt as he considered all the ramifications of his mountain exile. The territorial investigator arrived the following week, a methodical man named Samuel Morrison, whose reputation for thorough, impartial fact-gathering had earned him assignments in sensitive cases throughout the Colorado Territory. Morrison interviewed Thomas extensively about his Pennsylvania business operations, his financial obligations, and his decision-making process following the Peaceful Valley fire. "Mr. Blackwood," Morrison said during one of their sessions, "I need to understand your mental state during the period immediately following your family's death. Were you capable of rational decision-making regarding your business and financial obligations?" Thomas's answer demonstrated the psychological insight that months of therapeutic work had developed, though it also revealed the complexity of his emotional state during the crisis period. "Thomas remembers feeling like Thomas's mind was broken after losing Emily and James," he said carefully. "Thomas could not think about lumber mill or money or anything except wanting to die too. Running to mountains felt like only way to escape pain that was destroying Thomas's ability to function." Morrison's investigation extended beyond Thomas's testimony to include correspondence with Pennsylvania authorities, verification of the lumber mill's financial records, and interviews with witnesses who had known the family before their move to Colorado Territory. The process took several weeks, during which Thomas's anxiety about the outcome began affecting his therapeutic progress. Sarah noticed regression in several areas of his recovery. His speech became more halting when discussing anything related to responsibility or obligation. His appetite decreased significantly, and most troubling, he began withdrawing from the musical activities that had been central to his healing process. "Thomas not worthy of Sarah's songs," he said during one evening when she attempted to engage him in their usual therapeutic routine. "Thomas caused suffering for other people through weakness and cowardice. Thomas should accept punishment instead of seeking healing." The self-destructive thinking that had originally driven Thomas to mountain exile was reasserting itself under pressure from the legal investigation, threatening to undo months of careful therapeutic progress. Sarah realized that Victoria Blackwood's accusations represented more than legal complications. They were psychological warfare against a man whose recovery depended on believing himself worthy of compassion and redemption. Sarah made a decision that would prove crucial for protecting Thomas's psychological stability during the investigation period. She wrote directly to Victoria Blackwood, proposing a meeting where they could discuss Thomas's condition and explore solutions that might satisfy legitimate financial obligations without destroying his recovery. The response came by return mail, with Victoria accepting the invitation while making clear her skeptical attitude toward Thomas's supposed transformation. "Miss Bennett," she wrote, "while I appreciate your therapeutic efforts, I find it difficult to believe that my former brother-in-law has experienced the dramatic personality change you describe. The Thomas Blackwood I knew was a selfish, irresponsible man who abandoned his duties when they became inconvenient." Victoria Blackwood arrived at the rehabilitation facility on a snowy December morning, traveling an expensive carriage that announced her wealth and social status to everyone in the Corgi Valley. She was a woman in her 40s with sharp features and an imperious manner that suggested someone accustomed to having her way through force of personality and financial influence. Sarah met her in the facility's reception area. Noting the mixture of curiosity and distaste in Victoria's expression as she surveyed the rustic accommodations that had housed her former brother-in-law's recovery. "Mrs. Blackwood," Sarah said formally, "thank you for making this difficult journey. I believe seeing Thomas's current condition will help you understand the genuine nature of his transformation." Victoria's response was skeptical but not entirely hostile. "Miss Bennett, I've traveled a considerable distance based on your representations about my brother-in-law's supposed recovery. I hope you understand that I have significant financial obligations to consider, regardless of whatever psychological difficulties Thomas may have experienced. The confrontation between Victoria and Thomas would prove to be the most challenging test of his psychological stability since beginning his recovery. Sarah carefully orchestrated their meeting in the music therapy room, where Thomas's association with healing and growth would be most apparent, while preparing for emotional reactions that could threaten everything they'd accomplished. As Victoria entered the room where Thomas waited, Sarah could see the shock in her expression at his physical transformation. The mountain devil of territorial legend bore little resemblance to the brother-in-law she remembered, though his pale blue eyes remained unmistakably familiar. "Victoria," Thomas said quietly, rising to his full imposing height while maintaining the gentle demeanor that had become characteristic of his recovered personality. "Thomas is sorry for pain caused by Thomas's disappearance. Thomas knows Victoria suffered consequences of Thomas's failures. The reunion between the estranged relatives would determine not only Thomas's legal fate, but whether the healing power of music and compassion could survive the harsh judgment of a world that measured worth in financial terms, rather than human recovery. The tension in the music therapy room was palpable as Victoria Blackwood studied the massive figure who had once been her brother-in-law, her sharp eyes searching for signs of the man she remembered beneath the extraordinary physical transformation that years of mountain living had created. Thomas remained perfectly still under her scrutiny, his enormous hands clasped respectfully behind his back while he waited for her to speak. "You look like a monster," Victoria said finally, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Emily would be horrified to see what you've become, living like an animal, while decent people suffered the consequences of your cowardice." Sarah felt her breath catch at the deliberate cruelty of Victoria's opening statement, designed to inflict maximum psychological damage on a man whose recovery depended on believing himself worthy of compassion. But Thomas's response demonstrated the emotional regulation skills that months of therapeutic work had developed. "Thomas knows appearance is frightening," he replied quietly, his deep voice steady despite the obvious pain her words had caused. "Thomas became something inhuman to survive losing everything human that mattered." But Sarah helped Thomas remember that Emily loved the man inside, not the appearance outside. Victoria's expression shifted slightly at his measured response, though her hostility remained evident. "Pretty words, Thomas, but words don't repay the $3,000 you borrowed from the Merchants Bank of Philadelphia or compensate the suppliers whose payments you defaulted on when you disappeared into your convenient wilderness exile." The specific financial details hit Thomas like physical blows, each debt representing a person or business harmed by his desperate flight from unbearable grief. Sarah could see his massive frame beginning to tremble as the full weight of his abandoned responsibilities crashed over his carefully reconstructed sense of self-worth. "Thomas remembers every debt," he said, his voice breaking slightly as guilt threatened to overwhelm the psychological stability he'd worked so hard to achieve. Thomas wanted to honor obligations to Emily's memory, but Thomas's mind was broken. After losing family, Thomas could not think of anything except escaping pain. Victoria pressed her advantage ruthlessly, understanding that Thomas's recovered capacity for moral reasoning made him vulnerable to accusations about the collateral damage his trauma response had created. "Your pain doesn't excuse the suffering you caused other people, Thomas. While you were playing mountain man, honest families lost their savings because they trusted your word." Sarah recognized the dangerous psychological territory they were entering as Thomas began accepting full blame for consequences that extended far beyond his original intentions. The guilt and shame that had driven him to mountain exile were reasserting themselves with devastating force, threatening to destroy the fragile self-forgiveness that had enabled his recovery. "Mrs. Blackwood," Sarah interrupted, her professional training overriding social courtesy as she moved to protect her patient from psychological assault. Thomas's trauma response was medically documented and entirely consistent with severe grief reactions. His inability to function normally following such devastating loss doesn't constitute moral failure. But Victoria turned her sharp attention to Sarah with obvious disdain for what she viewed as misguided therapeutic enabling. "Miss Bennet, I appreciate your humanitarian impulses, but Thomas was a grown man with responsibilities that didn't disappear because he chose to indulge his grief in the wilderness. Other people have lost families without abandoning their obligations to society." The accusation that Thomas had chosen his mountain exile revealed Victoria's fundamental misunderstanding of trauma psychology, but Sarah recognized that logical arguments about mental health would carry little weight against Victoria's rigid moral framework. The wealthy widow operated from a worldview where personal responsibility was absolute and circumstances never excused failure to meet financial obligations. "Victoria speaks truth," Thomas said suddenly, his voice heavy with the self-condemnation that had characterized his early recovery phases. Thomas chose easy path of running away instead of difficult path of honoring commitments. Thomas caused suffering through selfishness and weakness. Sarah felt her heart sink as she watched Thomas embrace the guilt that Victoria was determined to impose on him. The psychological progress that had taken months to achieve was being systematically dismantled by someone who viewed his recovery as elaborate deception rather than genuine healing. "Thomas," Sarah said firmly, using techniques she developed for interrupting his negative thought spirals, "surviving devastating loss doesn't make you responsible for every consequence of that survival. You were a man in crisis who made the only choice that seemed possible for preserving your sanity." But Victoria had identified Thomas's psychological vulnerability and intended to exploit it fully. "Thomas always took the easy way out," she continued relentlessly. "When the lumber mill started failing, instead of working harder to save the business, he borrowed money and hoped for miracles. When Emily died, instead of honoring her memory by meeting his obligations, he ran away to avoid accountability." Each accusation struck at the core of Thomas's recovered self-worth, reopening psychological wounds that had barely begun to heal. Sarah could see the familiar signs of emotional collapse beginning to manifest, the trembling in his massive hands, the distant look in his pale blue eyes, the subtle withdrawal from human connection that preceded his most self-destructive episodes. "Thomas understands now," he said in a voice that had lost all the warmth and humanity that months of therapeutic work had restored. Thomas never deserved Sarah's kindness or healing songs. Thomas is a selfish beast who causes suffering for innocent people. The regression was happening with terrifying speed as Thomas abandoned the hard-won psychological insights that had enabled his recovery. Victoria's systematic assault on his self-worth was achieving exactly what she intended, forcing him to accept full responsibility for circumstances beyond his reasonable control, while rejecting the compassion that had made healing possible. Sarah made a desperate decision to interrupt the destructive dynamic by shifting focus from Thomas's alleged moral failures to practical solutions that might satisfy Victoria's financial concerns while preserving his psychological stability. "Mrs. Blackwood," she said with professional authority, "what would it take to resolve the financial obligations you're concerned about?" Victoria's answer revealed the calculating nature behind her apparent moral outrage. "Full repayment of principal and accumulated interest on all outstanding debts, plus compensation for the administrative costs incurred by creditors attempting to locate Thomas after his disappearance. Total obligation amounts to approximately $5,000, payable immediately upon Thomas's return to Pennsylvania." The enormous sum represented more money than most frontier residents would see in a lifetime, making immediate repayment impossible regardless of Thomas's intentions or current resources. Sarah realized that Victoria's demands were designed to be unattainable, ensuring continued leverage over Thomas while providing justification for whatever punishment she intended to impose. $5,000, Thomas repeated in a voice devoid of hope. Thomas has no money, no property, no way to repay debts that grew while Thomas lived as animal in mountains. Thomas can only offer to work until debts are satisfied, however long that might require. But Victoria rejected even this offer of indentured servitude with obvious satisfaction at maintaining her psychological advantage. Thomas, you're no longer capable of useful work. Look at yourself. You're a freakish giant who frightens decent people. What employer would hire someone with your appearance and history of abandoning responsibilities? Sarah watched in horror as Victoria systematically destroyed every possibility for redemption that Thomas might cling to, trapping him in a psychological prison where guilt and shame were the only certainties. The woman's cruelty seemed almost sadistic in its precision, targeting the exact emotional vulnerabilities that made Thomas most susceptible to self-destruction. Perhaps, Victoria continued with calculated malice, the territorial authorities should consider whether someone with your history of irresponsible behavior poses a continuing threat to public welfare. A man who abandons his debts and obligations might well abandon other commitments when they become inconvenient. The threat was clear. Victoria intended to use Thomas's financial history to argue against his rehabilitation and potential release, painting his recovery as elaborate deception designed to escape accountability for past failures. Her strategy would transform his psychological healing into evidence of criminal cunning rather than genuine therapeutic progress. Thomas's response to this final assault was complete emotional surrender. "Victoria is correct," he said in a voice that had lost all trace of the humanity Sarah had worked so hard to restore. "Thomas is dangerous because Thomas is weak. Thomas should remain caged to protect innocent people from Thomas's selfishness." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she witnessed the systematic destruction of everything they had accomplished together. The gentle giant who had learned to sing lullabies and carve wooden toys for children was disappearing back into the self-loathing that had originally driven him to mountain exile. But Dr. Webb, who had been silently observing the interaction, suddenly stepped forward with information that would completely transform the confrontation. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said with quiet authority, "before you continue your character assassination of Mr. Blackwood, perhaps you should know that the territorial investigation has uncovered some interesting facts about the financial situation in Pennsylvania." Victoria's expression shifted to uncertainty as Dr. Webb produced a telegram from the territorial investigator who had been researching Thomas's business records. "According to official documents," the doctor continued, "the Merchants Bank of Philadelphia was investigated for fraudulent lending practices in 1879, the year Thomas borrowed money for his mill expansion. Several bank officers were convicted of deliberately approving loans to failing businesses in order to seize valuable collateral when borrowers inevitably defaulted." The revelation struck Victoria like a thunderbolt, undermining her entire narrative about Thomas's supposed irresponsibility. If the bank had engaged in predatory lending, his financial difficulties might have been the result of criminal manipulation rather than personal failure. Furthermore, Dr. Webb continued, consulting additional telegrams, the lumber mill's decline was caused by a railroad monopoly that deliberately undercut local suppliers to drive them out of business. Thomas's operation was one of dozens destroyed by illegal pricing schemes that were prosecuted by federal authorities the following year. Sarah watched Victoria's face pale as the foundation of her accusations crumbled under the weight of documented evidence. The financial failures that she had attributed to Thomas's moral weakness were revealed as consequences of systematic fraud and criminal conspiracy that had targeted honest businessmen throughout the region. Thomas looked up from his hands with confused hope beginning to replace despair. "Thomas was not complete failure?" he asked hesitantly, afraid to believe that his guilt might be undeserved. "No, Thomas," Dr. Webb said firmly. "You were the victim of criminal enterprises that destroyed hundreds of legitimate businesses. Your financial difficulties were not caused by personal irresponsibility, but by systematic fraud that federal authorities eventually prosecuted." The truth about Thomas's Pennsylvania experience would reshape everything: his understanding of his own past, Victoria's legal standing to demand repayment, and most importantly, his psychological recovery from guilt that had never been entirely justified. The man who had condemned himself as a selfish failure was about to discover that he had been the victim of crimes beyond his ability to predict or prevent. The silence that followed Dr. Webb's revelation stretched through the music therapy room, like the calm after a mountain avalanche, leaving everyone stunned by the complete reversal of everything they thought they understood about Thomas Blackwood's past. Victoria stood frozen near the window, her carefully constructed case against Thomas crumbling as documented evidence exposed the criminal conspiracy that had destroyed his business and driven him toward the tragedy that would ultimately claim his family. Thomas himself appeared almost unable to process the information that absolved him of the guilt he had carried like a physical weight for nearly 4 years. His massive hands trembled as he looked up at Dr. Webb with eyes that held the first genuine hope Sarah had seen since Victoria's arrival had triggered his psychological regression. Thomas was not responsible. He asked hesitantly, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone afraid to believe in salvation after accepting damnation for so long. The mill failed because of criminal activity by others? Dr. Webb nodded firmly while producing additional telegrams that documented the scope of the fraud that had victimized dozens of honest businessmen throughout Pennsylvania. Thomas, you were systematically targeted by criminals who identified your mill as valuable collateral for loans they never intended to honor. Your business difficulties were manufactured by people who profited from destroying legitimate enterprises. The psychological impact of this revelation rippled through Thomas's consciousness like a stone dropped into still water, creating waves of understanding that would reshape his entire perception of his life before the Peaceful Valley fire. For years, he had condemned himself as a failure who had disappointed his wife and endangered his family through incompetence and irresponsibility. Emily. Thomas whispered, his voice breaking as he realized that his beloved wife had died never knowing that her husband had been the victim of criminal fraud rather than business failure. Emily believed Thomas was failing because Thomas was not good enough. Emily died thinking Thomas had disappointed her. Sarah moved quickly to his side as she recognized the complex grief that was replacing his false guilt sorrow for his wife's unnecessary worry, anger at the criminals who had manipulated their lives, and profound relief at discovering his innocence of the charges he had leveled against himself. The emotional transformation was so intense that she feared it might overwhelm his psychological stability just as completely as Victoria's accusations had done. Thomas, Sarah said gently, placing her hand on his massive shoulder while beginning to hum one of the melodies that had proven most effective for emotional regulation during his recovery. Emily loved you completely, regardless of business difficulties. She would be proud of the man you've become through surviving such impossible circumstances. Victoria finally found her voice, though her previous authoritative tone had been replaced by defensive uncertainty as the foundation of her moral superiority crumbled. Even if the bank engaged in questionable practices, she said weakly, Thomas still abandoned his responsibilities when he fled to Colorado Territory. He left creditors unable to recover their investments. But territorial investigator Morrison, who had arrived quietly during the confrontation, stepped forward with additional information that would complete Thomas's vindication. Mrs. Blackwood, he said with professional authority, federal investigators recovered most funds stolen through the banking fraud, and restitution was made to legitimate creditors. According to Treasury Department records, all valid claims against Thomas Blackwood's business were satisfied through the criminal asset forfeiture process. The final pillar of Victoria's case collapsed as Morrison explained that Thomas had been declared legally free of financial obligation 3 years earlier when federal prosecutors had used recovered criminal assets to compensate victims of the banking conspiracy. Her demands for repayment had no legal foundation, and her accusations of abandonment applied to debts that no longer existed. Furthermore, Morrison continued, Pennsylvania authorities have issued a formal apology to Mr. Blackwood and other fraud victims, acknowledging that their business failures were caused by criminal activity rather than personal incompetence. His reputation has been officially restored in all relevant records. Thomas's response to complete exoneration was more profound than anyone had anticipated. The psychological chains that had bound him to false guilt for 4 years suddenly shattered, releasing emotional energy that had been locked away since his family's death. For the first time since his capture, Thomas Blackwood wept not from sadness, but from overwhelming relief and gratitude. Thomas is free? He asked through tears that seemed to wash away years of accumulated self-hatred. Thomas can remember Emily and James with love instead of shame. Thomas can honor their memory instead of hiding from it. Sarah felt her own tears flowing as she witnessed the final breakthrough in Thomas's psychological recovery, the moment when he truly reclaimed his right to grieve his family's loss without the crushing weight of imagined responsibility for their suffering. The man who had been caged like a beast was finally completely free to be gentle as a lamb. Victoria's reaction to her complete defeat was a mixture of fury and grudging recognition that her campaign against Thomas had been based on false premises. I was told by bank officials that Thomas had defaulted deliberately, she said, her voice lacking conviction as she struggled to maintain some fragment of her position. I believed I was seeking justice for Emily's memory. Thomas surprised everyone by responding to Victoria's admission with compassion rather than anger, demonstrating the moral growth that his therapeutic journey had achieved. Victoria loved Emily too, he said with characteristic directness. Victoria wanted to protect Emily's honor when Victoria believed Thomas had failed as husband and provider. Thomas understands Victoria's anger, even if Victoria was wrong about Thomas's responsibility. The generosity of his response seemed to break something in Victoria's carefully maintained facade of righteous indignation. For the first time since her arrival, she looked at Thomas not as a symbol of moral failure, but as the grieving widower who had loved her sister deeply enough to nearly destroy himself when she died. I miss her too, Victoria said quietly, her voice barely audible as years of suppressed grief finally found expression. Emily was the only family I had left, and when she died, when you disappeared, I needed someone to blame for losing her. Sarah recognized the therapeutic moment that was developing as both Thomas and Victoria began processing the shared loss that had driven them apart. Perhaps, she suggested gently, you could help each other honor Emily's memory instead of fighting over responsibility for her death. The suggestion opened possibilities that neither had considered during their years of mutual antagonism. Thomas had grieved in isolation among the mountains, while Victoria had nursed her anger in the drawing rooms of Philadelphia society. Both had been damaged by loss, though their responses had taken dramatically different forms. Thomas would like to visit Emily's grave, he said hesitantly, afraid to voice the desire that had haunted him since beginning his recovery. Thomas wants to tell Emily about becoming human again, about learning to remember love instead of only pain. Victoria's response revealed depths of emotion she had kept carefully hidden beneath her harsh exterior. Emily was buried in Riverside Cemetery in Philadelphia, she said with obvious difficulty. I visit her grave every week, and I always wondered what became of you. Part of me hoped you were dead too, so you wouldn't have to carry the pain of losing them. The conversation that followed between the estranged relatives would prove more therapeutic than any formal counseling session, as they shared memories of Emily and little James that helped both process grief that had been complicated by guilt, anger, and misunderstanding. Thomas's stories about his wife's laughter and his son's curious questions complemented Victoria's recollections of family gatherings and holiday celebrations. Dr. Webb documented the remarkable psychological healing that occurred as Thomas and Victoria discovered their common love for the family they had both lost. The revelation of Thomas's innocence had removed the barrier of false guilt that had prevented healthy grieving, while Victoria's recognition of her misplaced blame allowed her to access emotions she had buried beneath righteous anger. As afternoon faded toward evening, Sarah made a suggestion that would symbolize Thomas's complete psychological recovery and social rehabilitation. "Thomas," she said, opening her grandmother's lullaby book to a page marked with faded ribbon, "would you like to sing something for Emily and James? A song that honors their memory and celebrates the love you shared?" Thomas nodded with deep emotion, understanding that performing music would represent his transformation from the savage mountain devil into a man capable of expressing beauty and tenderness. But instead of choosing one of the melodies they had practiced together, he surprised Sarah by beginning to sing a song she had never heard before. "Emily's favorite," he explained before beginning, his deep voice filling the room with a gentle Irish ballad about eternal love that survives death and separation. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, made more powerful by the raw emotion in Thomas's carefully controlled bass voice. Victoria joined in during the second verse, her refined soprano blending with Thomas's rough bass to create a harmony that bridged the gap between their different worlds while honoring the woman who had connected them. Sarah added her own voice to the final chorus, completing a musical tribute that transformed the therapy room into a sacred space where healing and memory could coexist. When the last notes faded, everyone understood that something fundamental had been resolved. Thomas Blackwood was no longer the broken man who had fled to the mountains in despair, nor was he the caged beast who had frightened mining camp visitors. He was a complete human being who had survived unimaginable loss and emerged stronger, gentler, and more compassionate than he had been before tragedy tested his capacity for endurance. The Territorial Evaluation Committee's final report, submitted 6 months later, would become a landmark document in frontier psychology and rehabilitation medicine. Thomas had not only achieved complete social rehabilitation, but had become a valued member of the Colorado Territory community, working as a wilderness guide and survival instructor whose knowledge helped save dozens of lives over the following years. His facility for working with traumatized individuals, particularly children who had experienced family loss, made him an unofficial therapeutic resource throughout the region. The mountain devil had become a gentle giant whose own recovery inspired hope in others facing seemingly impossible psychological challenges. Sarah continued her work at the rehabilitation facility, which expanded to serve trauma victims throughout the American West. Her innovative use of music therapy gained recognition from medical professionals across the country, leading to appointments at prestigious institutions and invitations to lecture about her groundbreaking techniques. But she never forgot the lessons learned during those first nights when she had approached a caged giant with nothing but lullabies and faith in the healing power of human compassion. The most important discoveries couldn't be found in medical textbooks. They emerged from the courage to see humanity in the most unlikely places and the wisdom to offer kindness even when it seemed impossible that such gestures could make any difference. Thomas and Victoria developed a relationship based on their shared love for Emily and James, eventually collaborating on a memorial garden that honored the peaceful Valley settlement victims while providing a place of peace for others dealing with traumatic loss. Their partnership demonstrated that even the deepest wounds could heal when people chose forgiveness over retribution and connection over isolation. On quiet evenings, Sarah would often find Thomas in the music room, playing simple melodies on the piano with hands that had once seemed capable only of violence and destruction. His playing was careful and deliberate. Each note offered like a prayer of gratitude for the second chance he had been given to discover the gentleness that had always existed within his giant frame. The man who had been caged like a beast had learned to be gentle as a lamb, not through force or punishment, but through the revolutionary discovery that even the most broken souls could be healed through patience, music, and the transformative power of unconditional human love. And in the Colorado mountains, where legends were born from the intersection of human courage and natural majesty, the story of Thomas Blackwood became something more than local folklore. It became proof that redemption was always possible, that healing could triumph over the deepest trauma, and that sometimes the most beautiful music emerged from the darkest silence. The lullabies that had once soothed a frightened giant continued to echo through the valley, carried on mountain winds that whispered of hope, healing, and the eternal possibility of starting over when love provides the courage to try. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.